Donald Trump has followed up his recent international tariff threats, US aid cuts, and the proposed ethnic cleansing of Gaza by trumpeting yet another series of major changes in the US foreign policy direction. This time on the pretext of Ukrainian leader Zelensky's NATO-backed failures in a war with Russia that the US president says should never have happened.
We have the power to end this war, and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine.
The conflict in Ukraine has cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of combatants. It's ensured that 20% of Ukraine is in Russian hands, whilst also spiraling Europe into further economic hardship and the US into more debt. The American president's unpredictability and his recent unilateral courting of the Russians at the expense of America's traditional Western European allies is sending shockwaves around the world.
We saw the President of the United States aligning himself with the dictator of Russia, Vladimir Putin, to undermine the independence of Ukraine and its democracy. Let's be clear. Trump is showing us that he sees one of the world's most brutal dictators as his friend and our longtime democratic allies in Europe as his enemies. He wants a world that is safe for authoritarians and oligarchs, but extremely dangerous for democracies. It will not surprise you when I tell you that Trump is lying, as he so often does.
But whatever happens next, it's important to understand Trump's position in light of his America First mantra, which frames the defense of Europe as an unnecessary financial burden. In this episode, we take a deep dive into many of the compelling counter-political narratives about the war in Ukraine, which have been suppressed by Western legacy media in favor of the NATO alliance's pro-war propaganda, narratives which Trump seems to be now echoing.
Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective, a show in which we break down the issues of the day from a countercultural, counter-political perspective. All too often we just hear the same narratives coming from mainstream media, which has essentially become propaganda, either state-run or corporate-run. This is not that space. We invite those people who've got genuine, honest voices and apply critical reasoning and are still in the business of trying to get to the truth by serious investigation, serious inquiry, and through, as I say, reasoning and the ability of our intellectual faculties. Not to patronize the mainstream too much, but really it's become so blatant now that we need these spaces for us to really be able to engage with the conversations that need to happen for the sake of humanity, because it's that critical now. So many of the issues that are being thrown at us are coming from places we don't even expect or suspect, all too often the establishment itself. So please do like and subscribe to this channel, share it far and wide so that people get the other view, which they're not getting from their mainstream sources of media. With me on the show today is, I'm very honoured to have Dr. Marcus Papadopolous. Welcome, Marcus.
It's a real pleasure to be here, so thank you ever so much for having me on.
Thank you for joining. And Marcus is the author of Arise Rossiya, and he's also the author of Whitehall in Stalin, Russia, which is very relevant to our show today because I'm going to be opening up that whole issue around Ukraine, Russia, and NATO's war on that region, essentially. That's a controversial thing to say, given what mainstream Western media would have us believe. But with me to sort of support or perhaps challenge some of our views, maybe it's going to be our good friend Fra Hughes, who's also written a book called Voices from Donbas. Voices from Donbas covers that very region of eastern Ukraine, which is dominated ultimately by people who speak the Russian language, are essentially Russians, and actually are at the center of the entire issue that is out there with the war in Ukraine. So without any further introductions from me, Marcus, I'm going to let you set the stage, because the accusation is that Vladimir Putin is an imperialist, that he's invaded the nation of Ukraine, violated their sovereignty, and he's doing it for the purposes of expanding Russian power and influence across the world. That's the accusation. That's what we're getting constantly from Western media. Do you agree?
Well, before I delve into that question, it is imperative for your audience to understand the history. And the history encompasses many centuries. So, of course, I will give an overview. A Ukrainian national identity only emerged in the late 19th century. And that was predominantly in what is today the westernmost part of Ukraine, principally Lvov, Ternopil, and Ivano-Frankivsk. Now, who created this concept of a Ukrainian national identity? Principally, it was the Austrians. Why? They created this concept as a way of trying to undermine the Russian Empire, because what they were saying is this: what was known as the Ukraine, a region within the Russian Empire, should be independent of the Russian Empire. So again, it was a way of the Habsburgs attempting to undermine the Romanov dynasty, the Russian Empire. Now, prior to the late 19th century, you will not hear any reference or read any reference to a Ukrainian national identity. If you go to the National Archives in Kew, which is the main archives in the United Kingdom, find me a document from the 17th century or the 18th century or most of the 19th century in which British diplomats refer to, quote, Ukrainians. You will not find one document. So we must go back to 1654. In 1654, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who was the leader of the Zaporozhian host, which was a Cossack state in what is today central Ukraine, appealed to Tsar Alexei, the Tsar of the Tsardom of Russia. At the time, it wasn't called the Russian Empire, it was called the Tsardom of Russia. So Bogdan Khmelnytsky of the Zaporozhian host appealed to the Tsardom of Russia for protection against the Poles and the Lithuanians. What he asked was for this Cossack state to be incorporated into the Tsardom of Russia. Tsar Alexei agreed to that, and the Treaty of Pereyaslav was signed. So, again, the Zaporozhian Cossacks were East Slavs who followed the Russian Orthodox faith. Now, after that, the Russian Empire began to expand, and they incorporated new areas, and those new areas were simply called the Ukraine. So at that time in 1654, you had a region simply called the Ukraine. It just meant the borderland. It was just a region. The Tsars added more areas to that, and it became known as the Ukraine. And of course, the Bolsheviks added new areas to that, and that became known as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Speed forward to 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev holds a national referendum in the USSR in March of 1991, in which the Soviet people are asked, do you wish to preserve the Soviet Union? 76% of the Soviet people vote to preserve the USSR. In the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the figure is over 70% voted to preserve that. So that demonstrates that the USSR was not a prison of peoples. Now, it is important for me to say this. In December of 1991, another referendum was held in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the other Soviet republics. Once again, the people were asked, do you wish to preserve the Soviet Union? But on this occasion, in the Ukrainian SSR, the overwhelming majority of people voted to secede. However, the wording was deliberately ambiguous. Most people in the Ukrainian SSR thought they were voting for autonomy from Moscow. What the leader, a Ukrainian nationalist leader called Leonid Kravchuk, had in mind was effectively to dupe them into voting for independence so that he could have his own country, his own fiefdom. So it is very important for people to understand that there is no such thing called a Ukrainian race. There are East Slavs comprised of the Russians, what we know today as the Belarusians, and the Ukrainians. The vast majority of people in Ukraine are part of the Russian Orthodox Church. East Slavs who adhere to the Russian Orthodox faith. That is a reality. Again, find a document from the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, most of the 19th century, in which British diplomats or politicians or military officials refer to Ukrainian race. You will not find one. What we see today, Ukraine, is an artificial construction, and it became independent against the wishes of 70% of the population. The only place in Ukraine where you will find very anti-Russian sentiment is the westernmost part. Lvov, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, Rivne and Volyn. Why? Because those regions were for centuries part of Poland, part of Austria, and then Poland again. There is a lot of Polish blood there, a lot of Lithuanian blood, a lot of Austrian blood, and a lot of the population are Catholic. Aside from that, you will not find anti-Russian sentiment in the rest of Ukraine.
Well, that is a fascinating context and background. Too often people want to ignore these. They haven't got time. It's kind of, you're going on to news shows where people just want sound bites and they want to quickly get to what the issue is. And all too often, there's a disservice done to the public where people don't want get given this kind of context, because that puts a completely different light on the very question I asked in the first place, which was what were Putin's interests? What was Russia's interest in Ukraine? If they're East Slavs, if the bulk of it is all literally, culturally, religiously and ethnically more or less the same people, it does put a little bit of a lie straight away into the kind of the narrative of some sort of separation between Russia, the Russian people and the people of Ukraine. So given that, I mean, even then, would you say that Putin's motives for doing what he did in Ukraine were based on trying to bring back those people into the fold, or was it, as some people are arguing, actually a genuine attempt to stop Nazis, basically violating the human rights of the people of the Donbas or that region? And I'll bring Fra in on this as well. But first, yourself on that. What were Putin's motives?
Well, firstly, Russia is a superpower. Therefore, in particular, a superpower has to have national security. It must have defense. America is predominant in Mexico and is predominant in Canada. Whether people like that or not, superpowers have to have their positions defended. Russia is no different. A Ukraine in NATO would constitute a formidable threat to Russian national security because, for example, NATO tactical aircraft operating, let's say, from the Kiev Oblast, Kiev region, or the Sumy Oblast, Sumy region, could reach Moscow in approximately 12 minutes. Also, Odessa and Nikolaev would become NATO Navy bases. That would challenge Russia in the Black Sea. I would be the first to condemn any move by Russia attempting to usurp America's predominance in Mexico, because that is dangerous. That would not be a good move. Likewise, it is unacceptable for America to try to usurp Russia's position as the dominant force in the former Soviet Union, with the exception of the Baltic states, because they are in the EU and they are in NATO. It is good for global peace, good for global stability, for there to be two superpowers. If you have one superpower, as you did in the 1990s and for the 2000s, you see chaos and anarchy. You see wars from the former Yugoslavia up into the invasion of Iraq, the destruction of Libya, and of course now the destruction of Syria. So certainly Putin acted to neutralize a potential threat in Ukraine. Of course, the Russians wish to protect their brethren in Ukraine and in other parts of the former Soviet Union. And clearly there was a serious threat posed to tens of millions of people in Ukraine who identify with Russia. That is not propaganda. The Western mainstream media says that Ruski Mir, the Russian world concept, is a propaganda technique by Putin. No, it's not. That concept has its origins in Tsarist Russia, where Russians, people who identify with the Russian world, are all together. So again, Russia clearly acted first and foremost out of national security motives, and secondly, to defend people who identify with Russia.
Well, it does seem as though NATO was pushing its luck. There was clearly Estonia, from Estonia to Poland, through to even Belarus, as well as Ukraine. It seemed as though NATO was on the march, wanting to erode a buffer zone, really, which would have been quite comfortable for Western Europe and Russia in a way, to sort of avoid a face-to-face standoff with nuclear powers on all sides. It makes sense to me. But Fra, I'm going to bring you in on this. Your book, Voices for Donbas, give me an overview of the Donbas, given the context that Dr. Marcus Papadopolous has given. Give us your perspective, how you got involved in that region, and what you make of the Donbas, and what was actually going on the ground. Was Vladimir Putin justified in going and, as he says, protecting those people, especially those with a strong allegiance to Russia and to Russian language, etc.?
First, let me thank for the invitation. And I agree with everything that Dr. Marcos has already said. If I talk about context myself, I would go to 2014 and the Maidan Square neo-Nazi fascists who were supported by Victoria Nuland and I think Anthony Blinken under the direction of Vice President Joe Biden at that time. We had a democratically elected government in Kiev. But there was a push from the West, from the EU, from America, the British and NATO to bring Ukraine into the Western fold. As part of that, what they done was they armed, financed and encouraged a fascist neo-Nazi group to hold demonstrations in Maidan Square, eventually leading to confrontations with the state police and then death and destruction in and around Maidan Square. So in Ukraine at that time, you had these neo-Nazis who wanted to join NATO, who were virulently anti-Russian and had been from the Banderite era during the Second World War, where many Ukrainians joined the SS. They were prevalent in the deportation and massacre of Ukrainian Jews and communists and gypsies and others. So you had the remnants of the Banderites from the Second World War. You had them being promoted by Western intelligence services like the CIA and MI6. Now, what happened in eastern Ukraine was that you had this fascist coup. You had the president elected at the time having to flee Ukraine under death threat. I was told that the three main roads that lead Ukraine to Russia, that connect these two countries, were armed and barricaded by the neo-fascists. And the president of the Ukraine had to drive in a convoy, sit in a field at night, and wait for a Russian helicopter to come and save his life from these people who were determined to carry out an extrajudicial murder against the democratically elected leader of Ukraine. So the people in the Donbas region, I visited both Lugansk and Donetsk, they told me that they never left Ukraine, that Ukraine left them. They did not agree or support this fascist Western-inspired coup. that overthrew the democratically elected government. I was told that in the years preceding this coup, that eastern Ukraine was almost demilitarized. They moved the army cadet headquarters from eastern Ukraine into western Ukraine. And with hindsight, it appears that there was already a deep set agenda at regime change within Ukraine. So the people in the Donbas, they witnessed the brutal murders of the people in Odessa. So you had pro-Western Maidan Square protests across Ukraine, and you had anti-Maidan Square pro-Western protests across Ukraine. And in Odessa, in May of, I'm not sure which year, I want to say 2014 or 2015, these neo-Nazis attacked the anti-Maidan Square trade unionist protesters. They chased them into the trade union building. There is evidence that they subsequently went from room to room and floor to floor, beating, murdering, and there are accusations of raping the people in the trade union building. They then barricaded the ground floor and set fire to the building, burning everyone inside. There were media commentators on Ukrainian television who said that the people that were burnt alive or burnt to death in Odessa were like Colorado cockroaches. Now, these are beetles that have a black body but a red head. This is national television in Ukraine celebrating the murder of innocent civilians in the trade union building in Odessa. And the people I spoke to in Lugansk and in Donetsk told me that when they murdered those people in Odessa, people decided to stand together and to prevent similar atrocities happening in their oblasts. So again, to reinforce this notion that the eastern Ukraine, the Russian-speaking Ukrainians said that they were Russian-speaking Ukrainians, proud to be Ukrainian, but refused to live under an imposed fascist coup that was brought about by people like Victoria Nuland, the ambassador, American ambassador to the Ukraine, who claims they spent $5 billion on regime change in the Ukraine. So I can only speak for myself. If I lived in Eastern Ukraine and I was a Russian-speaking Orthodox citizen and I saw people being murdered because they were also Russian-speaking Orthodox citizens, I think I too would have joined with my community in order to defend it against these neo-Nazis who were set loose with the armaments of the Ukrainian army, with the battalions of the Azov Brigade and others who were murdering people at will. When you talk about Putin coming into Eastern Ukraine in February 2022 as part of the special military operation, my view of this is that if you think and remember Minsk agreements 1 and 2, they were to be guaranteed on behalf of Ukraine by both France and Germany. Angela Merkel and I believe Francois Hollande said that they would be guarantors that Ukraine would not break the Minsk agreements, which was basically a de facto ceasefire along the disputed borders between Lugansk, Donetsk, and Western Ukraine. They have publicly stated from that time that they had no intention of honoring the Minsk agreements. Their intention, by implication, was to allow the Ukrainian army to be rearmed, to grow in size, with the intention, which is what it tried to do in December and then January in 2022, which was to reoccupy and to oppress the Russian-speaking Ukrainians.
Okay,
of
well,
Eastern
Fra, you've given us a really good, I think, supplement to what the background and the history that Dr. Marcus has given you. So it's really framed, I think, the whole chronological and various geopolitical implications for me. And what I'm really now wondering, and where the public, anybody watching the show, would be wondering, what's in it for the Americans, for the Europeans, and for NATO. I mean, apart from the geostrategic connections, I see that Ukraine had a lot of nuclear installations, so one doesn't know how much nuclear, if you like, power exists there, and whether nuclear weapons indeed, whether they existed there when everything broke down. I don't know, certainly in terms of economically, I mean, I get a serious hint that Ukraine is basically the breadbasket of Europe, and perhaps a large part of the world. They produced an enormous amount of grain, and I would also recognize that other gas, oil, etc., production that needs to pass through there would be vital. Are these the actual reasons why the West was so interested in, as you would argue, create this conflict with Russia?
First and foremost, ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, not collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union never collapsed. It was dissolved, and dissolved illegally by three treacherous Soviet politicians: Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk of the Ukraine, and Stanislav Shukevich of Belarus. So, ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December of 1991, the objective of the West, or let's be more precise, the Western ruling elites, has been to place a cordon sanitaire on the western border of the Russian Federation, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, to litter that region with NATO member states. Why? If you enclose Russia in Eastern Europe, you will weaken Russia in Europe, and you will weaken Russia in the world as a whole. So that is why NATO was expanded. In 1992, the first document emerged. Officially speaking, it was called the Pentagon's Plan in Defense Guidance. It's more commonly known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, after its architect, Paul Wolfowitz. And what it basically stated is that in 1992, whilst Russia is on its knees, which it was, still it has the potential to destroy the Western world. That was a reference to Russian nuclear weapons. Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So the Wolfowitz Doctrine advocated measures to be taken to ensure that Russia never rises. So that is why in 1999, the first countries in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, which had previously been a part of the Warsaw Pact, were admitted into NATO. And then going into the early 2000s, more states are added, for example, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. So first and foremost, it is the West's approach to Russia is about encircling it on its western borders in Europe to weaken it, first and foremost, before anything else. Secondly, of course, Ukraine has a very large industrial sector. It has a very large agricultural sector. It has a very skilled workforce stemming from the Soviet period. So, of course, Western conglomerates wish to take control of the industrial sector and the agricultural sector, and of course the workforce in Ukraine, to pay them peanuts and in return to get a very skillful production from them. So that is, of course, the second reason. But again, first and foremost, it is about weakening Russia. Again, if you encircle Russia on its western borders, which of course is in Europe, Russia can never again be the power that it was in the Soviet period. And there is no question about it. Ever since Putin came to power, even though initially he wanted a strategic partnership with America based on equality between the two, still he sought from 2000 onwards to re-establish Russia as the dominant outside force in the former Soviet Union, which is known as or what Moscow calls the near abroad. So I have no doubt going forward that the Russian army will win in Ukraine. The Russian army will take either all or most of Ukraine. I suspect it will take most of Ukraine. I believe the Russian army will advance to and capture the oblasts of Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, which, if you're looking at a map of Europe, of Ukraine, is to the west of Kiev. Those lands will be incorporated into the Russian Federation. After that, you will see other countries follow. For example, Belarus. There is a union state between Russia and Belarus because of Lukashenko, because Lukashenko wanted to be the president, he wanted to be in the Kremlin. That union state really hasn't materialized. However, to cut a long story short, ever since 2020, Putin now has Lukashenko where he wants him. So Putin is dominant. They're both alpha males, and two alpha males cannot get along. But because Putin now has the advantage over Lukashenko, because he came to Lukashenko's aid in 2020 when the West attempted to instigate a coup against him, we now see that Lukashenko has now backed off. So you will see, or we're seeing at the moment, a new Russia, an enlarged Russia is emerging. We already see Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson have been incorporated into the Russian Federation. More oblasts will be admitted and you will see other countries follow. And I would say Central Asia as well. Again, you go back to the March 1991 referendum. Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, they all voted over 90% to remain a part of the Soviet Union. After they became independent, they were the peoples of Central Asia were very, very angry with Russia. They felt abandoned. They felt abandoned by their mother country. Still today in Central Asia, a lot has happened in the last 30 or so years, but still Russia is the outside dominant force in Central Asia, despite attempts by China to usurp Russia's position there. And also the average person in Central Asia regards Russians as a fraternal people. So you will see a new union emerge sooner rather than later.
So it is a world in flux, and whoever dominates that Central Asian region, West Asia, Central Asia, tends to dominate the world. And it seems as though that battle is definitely not just a sideshow, but it's quite central, along with what's going on in Ukraine. But your points about the tussle over Eastern Europe, we'd describe it as Eastern Europe, I guess, that belt. It seems as though Europe has been the tail of the Americans and has been wagging quite furiously on behalf of the American orders. Because Nord Stream, I have to bring Nord Stream into this. I have to bring in the fact that the Ukraine war as an economic disaster for Europe is pretty obvious. I mean, just Britain alone, I know the billions of pounds which have gone towards Ukraine and the war as a whole, at a time when the NHS is falling apart. The rest of Britain is crying about austerity and poverty now. The mind boggles as to how far the European nations are willing to go to act in American interests at their own expense. I can't see any benefit from shutting down Nord Stream, where they would have had free oil, cheap oil, not free oil, cheap oil, and instead having to rely on more expensive oil and gas from elsewhere. I can't see any benefit in ripping apart the granary of Europe and creating more economic mess. Germany is in free fall industrially, as is pretty much the rest of Europe. Are they committing harikiri? Are they committing suicide by doing these sort of things?
Let me be brutally candid. Eastern Europe, including Hungary is not in Eastern Europe, it's Central Europe, but what we know as the old Eastern Bloc, those countries were satellite countries of the Soviet Union. There's no point denying that. The countries of Western Europe and Central Europe, for example, West Germany, they were satellite countries of Americas. That is a reality. Ever since the end of communism in Eastern Europe in 1989, of course, the whole of that part of Europe, because remember, Europe actually ends geographically in the Ural Mountains, but that part of Europe, what is today, I suppose, occupied by the European Union, became dominated by America or the Western ruling elites. So all of the countries today in Europe, which are in NATO and which are in the European Union, they are vassal states. They are colonies. That is why we see the puppets in Paris or in Berlin or in Rome or in Athens take decisions which are not conducive to the well-being of the Greek population or the German population or the French population. It is not in the interests of the ancient nations of Europe to be in an economic war with Russia, because it means they can't export their goods to Russia any longer. For example, Spain used to export vast amounts of agricultural goods such as tomatoes and oranges to Russia. They can't do that anymore. That is why the economies of Europe are in a dire state. When it comes to Germany, and I say this as someone who's a quarter German, and I'm extremely proud of my German heritage, but Britain, for example, ever since German unification in 1871, following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, Germany sought to neutralize, Britain sought to neutralize Germany, to destroy Germany, because they saw Germany as the principal threat to British power, followed by the Russian Empire. Cut a long story short, 1945, Britain has the opportunity to ensure that Germany can't rise again. Germany is crushed in 1945, it's divided, and of course the British and the Americans and the French, they take the western part. So the so-called German government today is a treacherous government. It cares nothing for the German people. It cares nothing for the German people's cultural and spiritual values. It cares nothing for their economic well-being. It is all about ensuring that the Western ruling elites remain supreme in the world. It is about defending and strengthening Western global hegemony. That is why, and I'm delighted to say, we see nationalist parties and patriotic parties emerging all over Europe. For example, AfD in Germany. Why? Because the ancient nations of Europe are angry. They are very, very angry. They don't want to be exploited economically any longer, and also they do not wish to see their cultural and spiritual values attacked, and that is exactly what has happened. And one of the ways that the Western ruling elite have attempted to destroy the nations of Europe is by bringing immigrants from outside of the Western world into the Western world to destroy the Western world from within. The Western ruling elites, whatever you think of them, they're the smartest in the world. They understand the best way of killing a nation is to kill its identity. A people with no culture is a people with no future. So again, these so-called governments in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Spain, they don't serve their people, they serve the Western ruling elites.
Well, migrants issues, wars of terror, this displacement business, certainly in West Asia, has created a migrant crisis, and it is having a knock-on effect in enhancing the desire for something to be done around that, no doubt. And Donald Trump has literally won the American elections based on the migrant issue as well. I've no doubt that that's the fundamental reason that he's back in power. But Fra, so many interesting issues that have been raised, but still outstanding for me is what's in it for Europe? I mean, I can see that Americans have been getting rid of their fracking oil, which is all stacked up in containers in Mexico, I hear, and of course, fracking oil costs 3 times the price of any oil that they were going to get from Russia, maybe far more than that as well. So the Germans and the Europeans have been buying this rather expensive oil from America and lost the benefit of Russian, energy imports at a cheaper rate. Makes absolutely no sense, but it makes sense from America's point of view, and even Donald Trump, who likes to do business, and he's been saying to the NATO client states that they've got to pay their way. He's been saying it to Saudi Arabia as well, that he milks the cow there, and he obviously wants to milk the cow here in Europe a little bit more. So he's back in power now. What do you see happening with Trump coming in? Because the other interesting thing about Donald Trump is that he's got a little soft spot for Vladimir Putin, so he says, so he seems to indicate, and he said he's going to stop the Ukrainian war. What do you see happening now that America's had a change of presidency, particularly in this region of Ukraine?
Okay, well, basically about Joe Biden, as I stated before, in 2014, he was really the instigator of the coup. Then when he came to power in 2020, we saw the build-up of the Ukrainian fascist neo-Nazi army. And then at the end of December 2021, we saw this build-up of 100,000 troops on the borderland with Luhansk and Donetsk in preparation for the reoccupation of eastern Ukraine and possible massacres. I think this was a bird trap set up to bring Russia into eastern Ukraine so that they could then claim that this was an expansionist, imperialist Putin, and that they were the aggressors in the region and not the CIA MI6 back coup of 2014. I could compare it to Afghanistan. Whenever the communist leaders in Kabul were faced with the Taliban, they were faced with bin Laden, who was financed, armed, directed, and encouraged by the CIA and the American administration to undertake a war against the democratically elected government in Kabul. That led to Russia being drawn into the internal kind of civil war machinations within Afghanistan, bearing in mind that bin Laden was a Saudi Arabian and wasn't an Afghan to begin with. So they drew Russia into Afghanistan. They were trying to make Afghanistan Russia's Vietnam. Now, that's what they've done in eastern Ukraine. And without laboring the point, what they have done is isolate economically and politically as much as they possibly could Russia from the international economic kind of world trade union. They have militarily tried to surround Russia, and the war in Ukraine was twofold. They were using sanctions to crush the Russian economy. They were using the advent of war, where Biden was prepared to fight until the last Ukrainian in order to embroil Russia and the Russian Federation in this deep mire of military war in eastern Ukraine, which has gone on now for over we're coming into now 3 years from February 2022. It was all designed to weaken Russia because there is a thought, an idea, a policy within the American administration that they will balkanize Russia into 9 separate states. And then what they will do is they will do what they have done in every other country that they have brought under economic sanction and regime change through coups. They then bring their own corporations in to run all the private businesses. So the bottom line is that America is embroiled in a Cold War with Russia in order to defeat the Russian Federation with the objective of eventually balkanizing Russia and taking over private enterprise in and within the Russian Federation. Plus, Russia has huge deposits of natural resources that are worth trillions of dollars going forward. So imperialism, through its capitalist masters, want to destroy Russia. Basically, they want to replace the oligarchs in Russia with American and European oligarchs. And what's happening in Europe is, yes, America is the leader of NATO, America tells the European Union that it has their back, that it will defend them in any conflict with Russia. Russia is not looking for a conflict with the European Union. Russia, like China, is looking to be treated with equality, tolerance, peace, and respect on the global stage of finance, of politics, and of the economy. It is the Americans from the Second World War. I mean, if you remember, nearly all of Europe and Russia were devastated after 1945. America never had any bombs dropped on the homeland of America. It became the economic world superpower because everything else basically was destroyed. So they had this era of prosperity through the 50s and 60s and 70s, while Russia was rebuilt, while China was rebuilt, while Asia was rebuilt. And it was only in the 1990s that we begin to see again the rising of the global South and West Asia as an economic bloc, as the military contrast
Well,
to
what about that, Fra? Because so far we've painted the picture of a Russia which is not after war, is peaceful, has no real ambitions to be a dominant power above the Americans or above the Europeans. But they would argue that Russia is actively building a Eurasian axis, which is an alternative center of economic power with China and with Iran and others and the global South generally. They'd argue also that Russia interfered in Syria as well to stop the regime change agenda which NATO had. So they opposed the Americans there and supported Assad and kept him in power for a little while until, of course, now it's collapsed and we seem to have a new emerging situation which is not absolutely clear as to what's going on. But suffice to say that they would say that actually the Americans could easily say the Russians are undermining American interests around the world, so we need to check them. And that's exactly the narrative coming from the neocons, whether it's the Trumpian ones or whether it's the Biden ones. They're all agreed generally on this idea that they need to take on China and take on Russia around the world in order to maintain their ascendancy economically. I mean, they'll also say Russia's trying to undermine the dollar. They want to de-dollarize, which would be a huge blow to America and its power around the world. So in light of that, don't you think that they, as a superpower, they have a natural reaction to say the rise of Russia, the rise of the Eurasian axis?
I thought capitalism believed in competition. Perhaps I'm wrong. Is there not a place within the world global finance and the world global economy for all these free markets to compete competitively on the global market, let their goods and services be offered to the global society, and let the people of the world decide where they want to spend their money, how they want to spend their money, where they want to spend their money, excuse me, and what they like to spend their money on.
Well, I'd say, I mean, it's a good point, but Marcus, this issue about the competition around the world, the three weapons of policy which get touted every time America or West or the NATO want to go and do things. They talk about democracy, they talk about equality and human rights. Putin has been attacked on all of these. The Americans would say that it's an illegitimate democracy, that what you've got is actually just an oligarchy in Russia. Not that America isn't an oligarchy, but they would accuse Putin of having an oligarchical establishment, and that actually it's just a show. It's a showboating set of elections and not really legitimate at all. They would say that Russia and Putin stand against LGBT. They stand against values, of Western values of equality, etc. They would certainly argue that there's no human rights. That Putin is some kind of Darth Vader style character who's got lots of people locked away if they dare to speak out against him. So they would argue, they would use that arsenal again to say these are other reasons why we can't allow Russia to gain ascendancy around the world, because he's going to bring this this kind of the empire of I guess, I'm trying to compare it to Star Wars here, but probably America is far closer to being the empire than Putin. But I'm playing devil's advocate. What do you say? I mean, to those arguments which the Americans would say why we don't like Putin?
Well, one of my first reactions is, if there are political prisoners in Russia, fine. There are also, since the summer of last year, political prisoners in Britain. Let us not forget that. Of course, the British establishment, along with the Western ruling elites as a whole, is using the term far right as a way of suppressing the cultural and spiritual identity of the Western nations, and it is also a way of suppressing free speech. So there are plenty of countries in the world who have political prisoners. Britain, fine. Russia, fine. Saudi Arabia is another country. Jordan is another country. And of course, the last two countries are devoted allies to the West. So let us not forget that. But turning to Russia, Russia is not the West. And there is no reason whatsoever as to why Russia should be the West. Russia has evolved in accordance with its identity, its values, and its historical experiences. Russia is not an angel. The Russian government is not an angel. Indeed, Russia and the Russian government are anything but angelic. But there is a difference. Russia does not claim to be whiter than white. It does not claim to be an angel. The Western ruling elites present themselves to the world as the defenders of democracy, of freedom, of human rights, and the rule of law. Well, of course, that is a completely untenable argument. We can cite so many cases which utterly refute that and demonstrate it to be baseless, cheap propaganda. I will say this: the Western ruling elites, and I believe the British establishment is at the heart of the Western ruling elites. So let me focus on the British establishment. The British establishment is the most criminal, the most violent, the most murderous, the most sadistic, the most duplicitous, the most deceitful, and the most intelligent ruling elite in history. And that is what the world is up against. I do not see any evidence whatsoever that Russia is, for example, a threat to Europe. I want evidence. If you're going to make that claim, you corroborate that with concrete evidence which a court of law would accept. So, for example, who sabotaged the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea? Was that Russia? No. Well, of course it wouldn't be Russia. No. Whoever did that is attempting to weaken the Russian economy and is attempting to move Europe to being even more of a vassal state of the West's or the Western ruling elites. So again, when someone says that Russia poses a threat, where is the evidence? Politicians in the West, journalists in the West, and so-called Russia experts in the West seldom, or if ever, corroborate their assertions with any evidence whatsoever. It is simply a matter of demonizing Russia as they have demonized Iran. Any country in a geostrategic part of the world which is truly independent and sovereign and which follows an independent foreign policy will be demonized. Sanctions will be placed on them in the hope that this will bring down the government in the country and a pro-Western government will emerge there and will ensure that that country becomes a slave to the West. That is the brutal reality. That's not Russian propaganda. That's not me being a Putin apologist. I have numerous criticisms of Putin, for example, at the beginning of his tenure in power, when he really did believe that America and Russia could be friends. For someone from the KGB, as someone who was in the KGB, Putin was extremely naive. Of course, his inner circle, what is known as the Siloviki, the men from the security apparatus, they said to him in 2000, 2001, 2002, you are making a very serious mistake. And of course, Putin learnt that in 2002 when America, under Bush Jr., withdrew America from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. That is when the Siloviki, the men around Putin, were able to say to him in simple English, well, in simple Russian, we were right and you were wrong. So I have numerous criticisms of Putin, but the point is this: the West is not the defender of what it claims to be. And let us not forget as well, if Russia is a threat to the West, how does that manifest itself? Because as someone who is British, I'm part English, part German, part Greek, I see the identity of the British people having been systematically destroyed. Who has done that? Well, it's not Putin, it's not Russia, it's the British establishment. Who has attacked the cultural and spiritual values of the British people? The British establishment. And the Western nations as a whole, who is attacking their national identity? It is the Western ruling elite. I don't want to see any culture in the world eroded. I don't want to see Pakistani culture eroded. I don't want to see Indian culture eroded, Sri Lankan culture, whatever. I also don't want to see British culture eroded. I don't want to see German culture eroded. Whoever is eroding the cultures of the ancient nations of Europe and the Western nations as a whole is the enemy to the Western nations. And it is clearly not Russia who is attacking the cultural and spiritual values of the Western nations.
Well, I take your point on board about the engineering of society, social and cultural engineering. That's a whole topic that needs to maybe be dealt with in a different project. Nobody can deny that cultures merge over time. Wars happen, empires overlap, and there's a natural exchange of cultures globally. But when it's engineered artificially, I'm willing to, obviously think about that very carefully. That if you've got cultures which are being transported overnight and changing the very dynamics of everything that exists in a society, that's a recipe for potential civil war and destruction, without a doubt. And we live in a time now where, migration, etc., and race and Islamophobia and feminism and genderism, gender fluidityism, or whatever you want to call it, everything can be weaponized as a political tool. Natural movements for differences and that exist within society, yes, that's inevitable, and people have differences. But when they get captured by corporate powers, moneylenders, and the state in combination to enhance their own power and to undermine society, absolutely. I think nobody would be happy with that if they knew exactly what was going. Trouble is, I don't think a lot of people know the full extent of how that is being engineered. But another show, we need to talk about that separately. We'll invite you in, Marcus. But we're going to conclude. I mean, come back to you. What do you see as the future now? What is a Russian vision in your eyes of the world? Because I know what the Western vision is. They're saying it very clearly. They say, we want to stay the ascendant, dominant power in the world. And it's not the West, it's the Western parasite elitists, if I can put it that way, those who are in power and who have the money. It's not the ordinary Westerners, but those guys are saying that we want to maintain power here in the West for the foreseeable future, next century or 2 centuries, and they are actively, it seems, constructing a world or trying to engineer a world where that happens. Are the Russians doing the same? Are they saying we want to dominate the world with Russian power projection and culture and systems and institutions?
If I could first comment on the move to the right by European societies, I don't believe it is in response to immigration. I believe it's in response to 40 or 50 years of neoliberalism from Thatcher and Reagan onwards, where we have seen the social fabric of society destroyed by the privatization of society, where profits are privatized and debt is publicized, where the taxpayer is paying to subsidize companies and groups that don't pay their taxes properly and are leading to the breakdown of the social fabric of all of Western Europe. As for Russia going forward, we have the American Western hegemony, the empire, which is willing to do anything to preserve its position of privilege, I'm going to call that white privilege in the global on the global stage. We have Russia, China, Iran. We have South Africa and Brazil in the BRICS, being joined by countries like Cuba and Vietnam and many countries in the global south. This is going to be the future of the world economy. The dollar will demise purely because American sanctions mean that countries under sanction cannot trade in the dollar. They cannot trade within the SWIFT transaction banking system. It means they must find alternatives to the dollar and alternatives to the Western banking system from which they are now excluded. So BRICS is a combination of countries that are under American and EU sanctions coming together in order to survive these sanctions, in order to protect their sovereignty, in order to protect their economy, and in order to protect their currency. So BRICS will grow. It already represents something like 45% of either the world's economy or the world's current GDP. As BRICS expands, the Western hegemonic empire will slowly recede, and it's a question of how much balance the Western empire is prepared to use to try and prevent the rise of BRICS. BRICS is not an empire. BRICS is a collection and combination of sovereign nations to which to unite economically and financially for the benefit of their own citizens, but also the benefit of the citizens of the globe. So I, for one, cannot wait to see BRICS enlarge, BRICS take over the economic powers of the world, and see tolerance, mutual respect, and understanding at the forefront of international politics, and not the white Western hegemony, which uses violence, it uses the other, it creates bogeymen in order to use its military powers, intervention through proxy wars and through immediate intervention by NATO, like they did in Libya, to destroy sovereign nations in order to continue to rape the resources of those countries in the benefit of the global north.
Thank you for that. Final word goes to you, Marcus. Fra's given the overview, but in terms of Ukraine, you hinted at what you saw was the future. What do you see over the next year to 5 years in Ukraine in this particular conflict?
Well, certainly Donald Trump will not end the war after 24 hours or whatever that ridiculous period of time he cited. It will take a very, very long time to bring to an end. But I stand by what I said in February of 2022 at the start of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine. I believe that the Russian army will emerge victorious. It has been winning from day one. Have there been setbacks? Yes, of course, there are setbacks. In every war, armies experience setbacks, but not major setbacks. The Russian army will capture either all or most of Ukraine. I believe the latter, most of Ukraine. I've already said I believe the Russian army will advance to and capture the oblasts of Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia. Would it be in the interest for the Russian army to go any further into deeply hostile places, regions, such as Ternopil, Lvov and Ivano-Frankivsk? I don't believe so, because that would mean having populations in Russia which are fervently, violently anti-Russian. And one argument can be made that that is a mistake which Stalin made in 1939 when he incorporated, for example, Lvov into the Soviet Union. By doing that, yes, he added depth to Soviet defences against Nazi Germany, but he also brought a population into the Soviet Union which hated everything about Russia. So Russia will win in Ukraine, and then we will see Russian power increase tremendously. Are the Western ruling elites or the Western Empire on the verge of defeat? No, I do not believe that. Never underestimate the Western Empire, the Western ruling elites. Too much is made of the BRICS. For example, India and China are both members of the BRICS, and they both bitterly dislike each other. Furthermore, the Chinese economic miracle is overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, based on China's economic relationship with America. So it is not in the interests for China to take any decision, make any move which could rupture its economic relationship with America. And likewise for America as well, it's not in the interest for there to be a rupture in the relationship with Beijing. It would hurt both Washington and Beijing. So I think too much is made of the BRICS, but certainly Russia will win in Ukraine. Its status as a superpower will become all the more enhanced. And as I said, other parts of the former Soviet Union will rejoin Russia. And what you will have going forward is what we saw during the Cold War. Two superpowers. Yes, there will be other centers of power in the world, but there will always be America and Russia, of course, unless America collapses. And there is a very distinct possibility because, for example, people in the Bible Belt want nothing to do with the US federal government. They want nothing to do with the wars in the Middle East or in the Balkans, etc., etc. So if Trump doesn't deliver, and I hope to God he does deliver even 5% of what he says he's going to do, but if he doesn't deliver, there's no excuses this time. His core supporters in the Bible Belt, in the old Confederacy, will rebel, and the people there are armed to the teeth. So it is possible that America could descend into a civil war.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, Fra Hughes, and thank you, Dr. Marcus Papadopolous, for an absolutely fascinating and riveting analysis of the Ukraine-Russia NATO scenario, but and some intriguing predictions as well. We wait to see how it all pans out. Certainly, it's in the interests of the world for this period of flux where there is, it seems, a new order, a new division of how the world is going to be run. We hope that it happens quickly, whichever way, because the ordinary public, at the end of the day, end up being the victims of the wars and all the shenanigans that go on in terms of the jostling for power and position. And one can only pray that this happens quickly with the least amount of loss of life. In the end, there are dark forces that arguably dictate most of this, because the parasite elite, who I'll put people like the organizations like BlackRock and State Street and huge mega transnational corporations into the mix, because they seem to have their eggs in every basket. And they also finance wars, back policies, and are very much central to creating what world will emerge. So there are forces at play at various different levels. We can only wait to see how that all turns out. Thank you for watching this edition of Deep Dive Perspective. And do hit the like button, share the videos, and subscribe to us. Until the next show, goodbye.